Alright, I think it's looking good. Right, so hello, good morning. It's very nice to be here again at TSU after 2 years. Originally, this was intended as a slightly more multi-dimensional presentation with a few more aspects. I was also thinking of mentioning the benefits of multilingualism, but then I saw in the program that there's already a session on that, so I decided to cut that short and focus on some of the aspects that might be more interesting or maybe a little less obvious. So I just need to keep this to move through. So in the first 20 or so minutes, I was thinking of focusing on some myths and misconceptions surrounding the ideas of multilingualism and bilingual education. So I'm first starting off with the more broad topic and then focusing on multilingual bilingual education, because as you may see throughout the presentation, there are still some myths and ideas that linger even in the professional community, for instance among speech language therapists. And then towards the second half of the presentation, I'm going to focus on one aspect that has received quite a little bit of attention also in the press on the benefits of multilingualism and why this aspect is quite controversial, why not all researchers are finding the same results. And then towards the end, I'm going to very briefly ask the question whether being multilingual helped cope with emergency remote instruction during the pandemic, and show some of our own results. Alright, so let's look at some of the myths that you can still find around in society. And one of them is that being bi or multilingual is somehow exceptional to the norm, and that usually people are monolingual. Now this is an idea that basically can be traced back to the 18th and 19th centuries and the formation of nation states, where people who were trying to bring nations together were trying to find a common denominator. And the language was seen as one of the elements that can unite a country. So language policies were trying to unify the citizens and create a national identity, where the language would be one of the aspects of that identity. This belief was also connected with the growth of colonialism, where it would usually be the colonizer who would impose their language. I mean, here in Georgia, you also know that from the times of the USSR, when the language that was sort of imposed was Russian. The prestige that would often be associated with the languages, and again, the languages of the colonizers would typically be seen, the more privileged ones. And then this monolingual idea can also be connected with the Saussurian and Chomskyan linguistic tradition of taking as the reference point an idealized native speaker, typically a monolingual native speaker. But if you look throughout history, then you'll see that the reason why some people end up being monolingual is simply because they weren't exposed to more than one language and they didn't have the opportunity to use more than one language in their daily life. When you've got that opportunity, then typically you're going to grow up bi or multilingual, and this is not a novel development. So here you can see a document from the 14th century in Poland. This is a religious scripture, as is common of historic documents from those times. And if you manage to figure out the script, you're going to see that you've got three languages there. So you've got Polish, German, and you've got Latin, and it's basically a translation of the sentences in these languages, and then they go on and on. And the three languages are there because the people who are reading these scriptures were typically more or less fluent in some of these languages, at least. And it's easy to forget that people are monolingual or are, let's say, multilingual more than monolingual if you take a very narrow Western perspective, but once you go beyond Europe or beyond North America, then you're going to see that actually being multilingual is the norm. And here are just a few examples from different contexts, by no means exclusive. Right. So the extent to which people speak multiple languages has actually brought us to a situation where more people in the world are multilingual than bilingual, and some researchers have been talking about the twilight of bilingualism, of course, the advantage of multilingualism. And as I said, this is something that's typical as you move beyond, let's say, Europe or North America. For instance, if you go to Africa, then typically you'll be expected to be using a few languages in your daily life. And there's even the tradition of linguistic exogamy, that is, you're supposed to marry a person who speaks a different native tongue than your own. So we shouldn't be surprised to come across situations such as this one. Now, this is a video clip. It's always tricky to see how it figures out with technology. Let's see how this one goes.
Excuse me. Sorry, do you speak English?
No, I don't, sorry.
My car's broken down and I wondered if you could tell me where to find a garage.
Well, that's wasted on me. I don't understand what you're saying.
I don't speak English at all.
Not a word, no. It's one of those things I wish I could. It's actually in school that, excuse me, do you speak any English? English? No. I don't know. I don't understand.
Hi, my car's broken down and I need to find a garage.
No, I'm so sorry. I don't understand at all.
Alright, thanks.
So if you go down that way, about half a mile, there's a village. There might be somebody there.
Ich speak ein bisschen Deutsch. Sprechen Sie Deutsch?
Deutsch, nein. Sprichst du Deutsch? Deutsch? Nur, zwei Wörter, aber ich bin nicht fließend. Yeah, sorry about that. Hey, no. Next time maybe we'll learn a bit English for you. Oder Deutsch vielleicht. Ja, das ist sehr toll.
Right, and now a myth that's connected with the previous one is that it's the most common for a child to grow up in an environment that only uses one language. But again, if you look at the statistics, then you'll be much harder pressed to find a monolingual child than a bilingual one. Here's an example. This is a kindergarten/primary school in Switzerland, in the bilingual town that's officially called Biel/Bienne. What you can see here is the ethnic diversity. You cannot see the languages, but what happens in the school is that 1/3 of the children coming to the school speak German at home, 1/3 speak French at home, and the remaining 1/3 are what is in the Swiss education system called allophone speakers. They speak neither of those languages. For half a day, instruction at the school takes place in German, typically Swiss German first, rather than standard German. For half a day in French, typically after the first year, the children are communicative in both. Also, many parents believe that in order to raise a bi or multilingual child, they should be competent and proficient in the languages. That certainly helps, but this is not necessarily an absolute requirement. There are many scenarios and situations and solutions that can allow us to bring up bi or multilingual children. Admittedly, some of these may need a bit of financial capital, but it's not necessarily impossible without that. Also, a lot of people think that you can only become multilingual if you start acquiring languages in childhood. That, again, is not the case. There are numerous studies showing that a later age of onset doesn't necessarily prevent you from becoming multilingual, and one of the best examples of counter-evidence to that myth is the phenomenon of first language attrition. That is what happens to you after you emigrate to another country and another language becomes your dominant one. Even if you emigrate as an adult, your first language will be affected. So if your first language can be affected, language that you grew up with, then it's obvious that, of course, the foreign language can also be affected in a similar way. The reason why most people do not end up being very proficient and indistinguishable from Bioroma or from native speakers of the target language is, first of all, because they use more than one language, and the other reason is that they also have other things on their hands rather than just acquiring the language, which children typically don't have to contend with. A mirror image of the previous myth is that if you do start acquiring more than one language in childhood, then you're going to end up being a balanced bilingual. That is also not the case, maybe unfortunately for some. Studies carried out by Annick de Hauer, for instance, showed that a quarter of children who were being brought up bilingually did not end up being proficient and equally proficient in the two languages. The method that's most commonly employed by parents in bilingual upbringing is one parent, one language. So, for instance, one parent will speak Georgian, the other parent may be speaking English. But as soon as the child starts leaving the house and spending more and more time in another language, the dominant language of the society, the home language needs to balance that disproportion. So a better strategy is when the minority language, the language that's only used at home, really has sufficient exposure and opportunities for practice than if it's only spoken by one of the parents. Also, quite a few people, including some speech therapists, think that if you start a child with more than one language, then the children are going to mix them up. That is not the case, and studies looking even at infants show that the infants are able to distinguish which language is spoken by which adult. It's just that you might not realize now because the child isn't really speaking at that moment yet, because they're just babbling at that stage. And also quite a lot of people who would be labeled as bilingual by linguists do not think that they themselves deserve that label because they think that they should be native-like. That is a criterion that goes back to a definition by Bloomfield from 1933. So that's a definition that's basically a century old. Today, it's assumed that you are bi or multilingual as long as you can use the languages concerned to meet your goals. And this is recognized even in educational policies. So, for instance, again, the Swiss education system has this useful notion of functional plurilingualism, and that recognizes that when we use more than one language, then we use more than one language because they fulfill different goals. We use them with different interlocutors, we use them to talk about different topics, and it's obvious that they're going to basically evolve to different extents and different levels of proficiency. You can think of an analogy with biology and the concept of ecological niches. Typically, if you go to one territory, you will not find two animals in that territory that do this exact same thing, that feed at the same time, that eat the same things, that hunt the same kind of prey, and that have the same behavior because they would be in competition. And the same with languages. Languages have different goals, so it's obvious that they develop to different levels. Let me give you an example. So this is a pentalingual speaker. She speaks 5 languages. She was born and brought up in Switzerland, but her parents came from Croatia. So you can see that she's, in terms of listening and conversation skills, she is strongest in Croatian, the language of the home, and Swiss German, the language of the street, the language of the kindergarten, the language of service encounters. But her reading and writing are strongest in Standard German, or Hochdeutsch. And that's the language of schooling, and it's at school that you learn to read and write. So this is very different from what high-stakes mainstream language exams would expect you to know. For instance, if you take an exam in English to get a certificate, for instance, stating that you're at B2 level, you can take Cambridge, IELTS, TOEFL, Trinity College, any of those exams, In order to get a certificate stating that you're at beta level, you have to be at B2 in listening, reading, speaking, writing, interaction, mediation. You fail one of those components, you fail the exam. That is not the reality of multilingual speakers today. Alright, so those were a few myths that concerned bilingualism and multilingualism. There are also a few types specifically with bilingual education and bilingual upbringing. So many people think that, or at least used to think that childhood bilingualism is detrimental to linguistic and cognitive development. If you looked at very early literature on bilingualism from the end of the 19th century, you could come across papers saying that a child growing up with two languages rattling around the head would have their intellect not doubled but halved. This is a quote from a paper from 1890. And for around 6 decades, that belief used to hold due to a few reasons. So one, what was the easiest population to access to find bilingual speakers? Immigrants or rural areas. And that means that you're automatically comparing two different populations. Immigrants that have gone through stressful situations, they had incomplete education, and so forth, compared with monolingual speakers. Rural populations, lower socioeconomic status, typically the children would have to help out their parents in the field, in agriculture, so again comparing two different groups. Also, the intelligence tests that were used in those early studies were typically phrased in the dominant language of the country, not necessarily the dominant language of students. The students were compared with monolingual and other bilinguals. Sometimes those tests included culture-bound items, and these are really difficult to acquire because these are included in citizenship tests. Typically need a few years of immersion in the culture in order to really be able to navigate those. And often there was an agenda behind those tests, aiming to show that it's better if the children abandon their home language and become speakers of the majority language. And it wasn't until a study in the 1960s that showed that actually bilinguals outperform monolinguals on a number of verbal and non-verbal abilities, and then the studies showed more benefits there. A specific version of a previous myth is that exposing the child to more than one tongue may cause language deficits. Again, that is not the case, and studies investigating what was used to be called a specific language impairment, that's now called developmental language disorder, show that first of all, there is no connection between being bilingual and having specific language impairment. Moreover, actually students who are bilingual outperform monolingual children with DLitt, because basically they have more practice in balancing the languages and focusing on which language they want to speak. And we can also bring up the idea or evidence from a real-life experiment showing why the inclusion of the home language can actually help students. So at the beginning of this century, 3 states in the US, that is California, Arizona, and Massachusetts, passed bills that were removing the support of Spanish language education for Hispanic or Latina students, because the parents were thinking that it's better if the children acquire the English language faster, so let's remove the Spanish from schools for them because this is slowing them down. That was the parents' idea. So that's what happened. And then a few years later, it turned out that many of those students now need an additional year of education in order to catch up with their peers who had that provision of Spanish at school. Also, many people think that this is now the era of specialization. It's better if you do one thing well than if you do 2 things on an okay level. I hope that the previous examples that we've shown are evidence that that is a very short-sighted perspective. Even if just because it deprives the children from being able to communicate with members of the extended family. And let me illustrate that with another video clip, which was aired a few years ago by a Polish auction platform like eBay, a Polish equivalent. Resonating also among laypersons. And I'm going to be skipping a bunch of slides in the interest of time and in order to focus on our own studies. So I will probably want to go to slide somewhere around here. Yes. So whether being bi or multilingual helped when the COVID pandemic hit and when we had to transition to emergency remote instruction. So this comes from a larger study of ours that we carried out during the first 1.5 waves of the pandemic, accessing teachers and students, mainly language and linguistics instructors and language students and majors in linguistics, language teaching, modern languages and related fields, where we were more broadly only looking at different aspects that could have facilitated or impeded coping with the situation, but we also looked at the languages that were spoken by the participants. So here's a map with the locations of the respondents. You can see that, as is usually the case in such large-scale studies, Europe, Central Western Europe and North America are best represented, but we also had quite a lot of participants from Georgia, which we're very grateful for, and also other parts of the world. The question concerning the relationship between being multilingual or polyglot and coping showed a few interesting results. So those teachers, if we first look at teachers, then we're going to look at students. Those teachers who were more polyglot, that is, they spoke more languages and high levels of proficiency, they were showing quite a bit more stability than their colleagues who were less polyglot or more monolingual. Stability both in life and in instruction in terms of not adjusting, for instance, or making a lot of changes in their instruction. They were also more confident than their monolingual colleagues. They thought the students were coping better. They wouldn't cut down on class time. On the downside, they were missing conference trips much more than their less polyglot colleagues, showing that perhaps they have more opportunities to go and travel abroad. If we go to language learners, and the correlations are weaker, but we also find a few relationships that are similar to those among instructors, that is the complaints among multilingual learners concern, again, missing, for instance, travel, and also a bit of social isolation. But on the upside, they thought their situation was typically not so bad. They were doing pretty well in class, and they had been through crisis before. Now, to end with, because the focus of this conference is, of course, language teaching, language learning, there's one more aspect that I was thinking about including. We also found a correlation between multilingualism and a few personality traits. And these were love of learning, perseverance, self-discipline, creativity, curiosity, flexibility, competence. Of course, these do not mean that being multilingual brings about these traits. It's often the other way around. It's these traits that allow you to reach further stages of education. Alright, but how can we measure multilingualism? And that's the last part of this talk. Well, what we did was ask participants to look at self-descriptors of the different language levels and say which languages they speak and at which level of proficiency, so that even if you're not familiar with the Common European Framework of Reference, you could look at those statements and you could say, all right, I'm A2 in this language. All right, but then for correlations, you need to put a number on it. And there are three ways in which this can be done. One is you assign points, A1 1 point, A2 2 points, up to C2 being 6 points. But the different levels of proficiency require different amounts of time in order to reach them, with different amounts of effort. So here, if you look at one estimate, you'll see that in order to reach A1 from scratch, you need around 95 guided learning hours. Those are hours with an instructor textbook. That's the same amount of time you need to progress from A1 to A2. But in order to move from C1 to C2, you need around 350 hours. That's 4 times as much. So that means that if A1 is worth 1 point and A2 is worth 2 points, C2 is worth 12 points. Let's see how these three pan out. Well, if we look at the correlations, we see that just counting the level of proficiency as A1 1 point, or let's say three things. If you just count the number of languages, then that's the lowest score, and that's not what we typically expect. The best one is if you weigh the proficiency, but actually the box that's best for us is the blue box, because it's narrowest, so it gives us more confidence. So if you want to measure proficiency, then the best way is to assign the points based on how much time you're expecting students to need to reach those levels. Alright, I think that my time is up. If you're interested